So today let's focus on trauma survival style number one, which is called the connection survival style. This is a survival style that develops out of people who are traumatized very early in life. It tends to be the most prominent. Um, and so all of us who've experienced trauma in some way will in some way most likely show some symptoms and some resonance with this connection survival style. But those who are more severely traumatized or those who are traumatized earlier in life tend to have more severe symptoms. But, it's something that I think we can all relate to on some level. So, what is a connection survival style and how does it develop? It develops when early trauma causes a disconnection and a dissociation from the body, from the environment, and from relationships. So, when you're young, you don't have the ability to get out of a painful situation. You can't escape it physically. And so, it's kind of like you just leave mentally, or you leave emotionally, or you leave spiritually. Like this goes back to that not being fully present. This is a style that's mostly like adapted by learning just to retreat internally if they can't get out externally. Um,
Uh, I have a
Go
question
ahead.
actually before we go on.
Yeah.
Are you speaking to the level of like derealization or something before that? Not quite that level.
What do you mean when you say derealization? I don't think I've heard that.
Uh, it's a feeling that a lot of people get when they have a very high levels of anxiety, where they actively dissociate themselves from their bodies, and it's as if they're living their life through a glass and an external perspective.
Oh yeah, exactly. That is an example of what I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be
Okay.
that extreme, but it's like that's what's going on.
Okay.
And so derealization, from what you described, that might be more on the extreme level, but it's a disconnection from their body, disconnection from their present lived experience. Um, they sort of retreat in some
Okay.
way.
All right.
Uh,
Thank you.
enter, yeah, thank you. Anybody else have a question? Please, jump in. So the person with the connection survival style, their energy it looks, you would describe it as someone being full of shock and trauma energy. Referring back to that idea of life force, which I didn't really go too deep into, but if you were just to describe this person's energy, they hold a lot of shock and trauma inside them. Um, their nervous system is like on 10. And so, the way they deal, because it's overwhelming to hold that kind of energy and be in your body. So what they do is leave their body, and so they disconnect from themselves and don't realize necessarily that nervous energy is inside of them. Um, However, it shows up in certain situations. One is it reduces their capacity of resilience, and so this is the person where, like, I'm just pulling this example out of the air. I'm just making this up. But let's say, you've probably seen that scene on TV where somebody puts a quarter in a vending machine and the candy bar doesn't come out, and they hit the machine and the candy bar doesn't fall, and they have a meltdown, like trying to smash the, machine open, or whatever, or like somebody cuts them off in traffic and they just fly off it's like that sort of thing where it's like that, those triggers that normally wouldn't be as triggering for the person who has this shock and trauma energy inside of them, those things will, um, how do I describe this? So it's like that brings them back to that intensity that's there, that they don't necessarily know is there because they're disconnected from it, but it shows its head when, something that would normally be a minor trigger becomes a major thing. Just an example of where I've seen this from my own life. Um, I remember in school, this kid in PE class had his jacket on a bench, and like the sleeve of his jacket was on the floor, touching the floor, and somebody accidentally stepped on the sleeve of his jacket, and he just went off and like beat this dude down, stomping on him and everything. Like, that's an example of like that trigger shouldn't have been that intense, but obviously something was pre-existing in that child for him to like erupt like that. Actually, let me stop here and just ask some questions. Can anyone else give an example, either, that they make up or that they've seen in real life of this phenomenon happening, where it's like, okay, you see that there's some pre-existing shock and trauma energy in someone because what should have been a minor thing, or what should not have produced the reaction it got, caused somebody to blow up. Has anybody seen that happen before?
I have
I'm
an
gonna be.
example.
Go ahead.
I'll just say I have an example I used to use in my training when I used to train trauma. There was a football player played for the Giants, I believe. And when he was in junior high, him and his best friend were, just playing around in school one day, and his best friend said something to him, and he ended up beating the dog mess out of his best friend. And so, to the point that the school called the police. The police came to the school, and then the police officer was in tuned enough to say, something ain't right here. You know what I'm saying? This is this young man's best friend. Why is he beating this child up like this? And they had also called the child's stepfather to come pick him up. So you got to know that part too. And so the police officer just kept on asking, what's wrong, because the reaction did not meet, was exaggerated to what had happened and stuff. And come to find out, the young man had been being molested by his stepdad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that trauma of that,
Yeah, yeah.
the best friend just triggered it, and he beat the dog mess. But apparently, the police officer who responded apparently was kind of in tune with like that energy, or something ain't right here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example.
I'm gonna have to look his name up, so because he was on Oprah and stuff, so he told his story, and he also did an interview with some magazine and stuff, so you could just kind of hear the whole story and everything. So it's really interesting. But that incident, when you were talking about this, reminded me of that incident with him.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly it. Somebody else was going to chime in also, I think.
It was me, Erica. I was just going back to what you said about the driving situation. I'm like, okay, from a non-driver, he was
Oh,
doing
yeah. Again, some of this is relatable. It's on a spectrum. I'm sure you haven't like
no,
killed anyone
but
or
I'm
whatever.
saying,
Yeah.
because of that, it had me to actually rethink things and look at things from that perspective, because one of my main triggers is traffic, because I drive so much. So it's like I get angry with people that do stupid stuff while driving, like angry. And I had to think about, okay, is this really concerning driving, or is this something? And most of it is driving, because I have to deal with these issues on a daily. But as I think about it now, why it irritates me now is because my monitor has like she has anger issues. So everything that somebody do, like she holler at the kids all the time, and when I don't have her on the bus, everything's peaceful. I don't have to deal with the things with the kid. I say something, they do it. We don't have that problem. But when she's on the bus, everything is over exaggerated, because we're all feeling her energy. So everything's different. The kids are louder. When something happened while I'm driving, I'm more irritated. And I probably wouldn't be if she wasn't. So it streams from what you were saying about the energy force, and also the fact that it's outside situations that make it more intense than what it would be without the outside force.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely hold that point, because we're going to talk about that a little later on when we get into like specific ways this style manifests, because that's a huge point. Overall, though, the goal is you want to get to a point where you can tolerate, like, how do I say this? You want to be able to digest more and more things. And so the ideal is to get to the point where we can be grounded and centered in ourselves, to the point where someone else's or the environmental things don't throw us off our center as much. But somebody who's in this state, that's just not as easy to do. They'll be more likely, like the example you said, like they'll like go into a rage over a child's whatever, misbehavior on a bus or something like that, just because they just don't have the capacity to be as resilient as they normally would, because they're already carrying so much. That's the take home point. Their bodies, their nervous system is carrying a lot, and they've learned to adapt to that probably from an early age. Oh, I need to survive and function, even though I have a ton inside of me right now. But for the sake of getting through the day, for the sake of getting through life, I have to disconnect from all of this because it's overwhelming to me. I can't deal with it right now. I have to disconnect from it, and move in that way, and move in a way that's really out of my body.
Yeah.
But yeah, those things that bring you into the moment can sometimes be the annoyances, the triggers, and it brings you back to like, oh wow, I have a lot inside of me right now, and this person's who just annoyed me is about to get all of it, like that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, that's really what we're looking at here. The stuff in blue is just little things I'm adding just from my practice doing, like, I guess you could say, working with life force and practices like Reiki and things like that. In my personal experience, this relates heavily to the root chakra. The root chakra is the chakra that deals with being in body, being in physicality, and all of that. And sometimes, especially when a person has been traumatized, their energy shoots out of that root chakra, which is at the base of the spine, at the bottom of your seat, and it flies upward. And we'll see it goes into higher chakras like the crown and the third eye at the top of your head. That's just my personal sense when I work with people doing like energy work. I was like, oh, that feels like what's happening here, and that tracks this information now.
One thing before you go forward,
Yep.
to go back to what we were saying about the trauma and things. This is one thing about this person. She knows the trauma. She always uses and say, I was not this way, is what I've been through, and people made me this way. So to know that the trauma came from this, like certain situations and people and everything, but instead of trying to fix it, she used it as an excuse and continue to be that way.
Okay. That goes back to the very first slide. Where is it? No hurt survives for long without our help. And so at some point, the question doesn't become, okay, yeah, I know you went through this. I know you went through this when you were growing up, but you're out of that situation now. You are physically not in that danger now. You are not in that predicament that made you this way now. And so the question now is, well, what are you doing to perpetuate back then in the right now? If that makes sense, right? Like, so it's not just that, okay, we definitely want to acknowledge that someone has been through a traumatizing hurt, something that was unfair, something that they didn't deserve to have faced them. But they also need to take responsibility for the ways they are continuing that pattern or continuing that pain or continuing that trauma. That is their responsibility, right? You get what I'm saying? And so that becomes
Oh, yeah.
what a person that becomes what a person has to deal with is, yes, you went through it back then, and yes, it was unfair, and yes, it caused damage. We don't want to disregard that. In fact, that's something we want to be sympathetic to and empathize with. What we don't empathize with, though, is the decision to keep perpetuating the hurt. So it's one thing to have been traumatized, but when you continue traumatizing and re-traumatizing and, you know, keeping that trauma alive, that is your conscious decision as an adult. And, that's what we're here to work on and stop. So that's a little bit of background on how it develops. How do you notice it? It has a lot of symptoms, physical symptoms. It'll show up in breathing. Energy wise, a person with shock or trauma energy is sort of a frozen energy that they hold. I feel it something like kind of close to the spine, but in the midsection and the thorax, there's like a clenching, there's a tightness that they hold inside them. And one of the consequences of that is they have shallow breathing or sometimes even holding their breath. People with this trauma symptoms have this trauma style have difficulty with breathing. You're also going to notice it in the eyes. Eyes will be a giveaway usually as well. Their eyes are going to be sometimes, if they're disconnected, you know, there's some people that have glazed over eyes, empty eyes. You know, on the extreme end, it's like that serial killer eyes when you see somebody look at you and it's like they just there ain't nothing there, you know, like they don't feel anything. There's that emptiness, darting, twitching eyes, sometimes separating eyes. Some people that have been traumatized, you might see one eye begin to like move or separate or lose track or lose coordination with the other one. And eye contact, especially people like, for example, on the autism spectrum, they have trouble maintaining eye contact. People who have early trauma have that same issue. And then you'll see it in physical illness as well. That carrying that shock and trauma energy often will result in some form of tiredness. So fatigue and fibromyalgia are common. Also, because of the clenching and tightness in the abdomen area, irritable bowel syndrome, digestive syndrome, bowel problems, something in that area will show itself as well. ADHD, asthma, allergies, and related issues like that can show up as well. And then there are the emotional symptoms, the ones we've talked about, where people dissociate, they leave their body. But because of this chronic trauma, shock energy inside of them, it can lead to the extremes of depression or the extreme of anxiety and panic. And they don't do well, again, like they're already flooded with a lot inside of them. And so it's not going to go well when you add on any form of intensity on top of that. They're already intense, whether they realize it or not. And so a heavy display of emotionality of any form is probably going to become like jarring to them. So just an example, Angie had me talk to a young woman who kind of showed some examples of that, where like she sometimes, like when she was triggered, needed to be away from noise, needed to be away from like, loud displays, that kind of thing. And what's commonly beneath that is actually anger. And so they show a lot of anxiety and fear and panic just because that's sort of the default emotion that's kind of been grooved into their bodies. But that default emotion is not really what they're feeling. A lot of times the fear and the anxiety is actually rage. These people are typically angry about the lack of their needs being met as children. They're angry about the way life treated them. They're angry about what happened to them. They're angry, and that anger has built up and not been expressed over time. It shows itself as anxiety. And then, kind of again, going back to the energy kind of life force perspective, which you could call the spiritual perspective. As I was mentioning before, I tend to experience this as a root chakra wound. This is something early on affecting their groundedness and their embodiment and physicality. And it leads to energy kind of shooting upward out of the body. And you'll see shaking and trembling. I like that these authors of this book talk about that. A lot of times when you see shaking or trembling and that kind of thing going on, or you feel that vibration, it's actually excess energy being discharged from the body. And so some of that shock and trauma energy, when it's finally being released, it's, you'll feel a trembling, or they will sense a shaking. And they may interpret that negatively, but it's actually a good thing. And so that's something to keep in mind. Like that shaking or trembling is oftentimes good. It means that, that release is happening. They just need to breathe and be grounded and as much as possible and allow it to release. So, all right, that's the physicality of it. That's how it impacts the body. That's how it impacts the energy. How does it impact identity? How does this connection survival style impact the way you see yourself or the way, you see others? What often happens is, all right, they get those shame-based identifications we were talking about before, where they see themselves negatively. Some common shame-based identities that people who've been through this type of trauma develop is a sense of inadequacy. I'm not enough. I can't do this. I'm helpless. I'm helpless. I'm a failure. I'm going to fail, that kind of thing. Like, I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable, whatever. Some sense of being fearful and inadequate. Also shame about existing. And so there can be some suicidal ideation with this type of survival style. Like, everybody would be better off if I was dead, or sometimes I wish I wasn't even alive, that kind of thing. Suicidal ideation is not necessarily the same as being a suicidal person. But this is just the idea of like, my life is a burden or a negative rather than a contribution or a positive. It's like, my existence detracts rather than adds. Also feeling like the outsider, feeling like they don't belong, feeling like they don't fit in. And yeah, being a burden. That's a huge fear, is this idea of being a burden or a stress on the people as opposed to like contributing or being helpful. Like we said before, especially when people have these shame-based identities, they sometimes over-exaggerate the positive side, trying to make up for it. So one thing this survival style does a lot is they will emphasize a role or a title. I remember my pastor said one time in a sermon, like, people who feel smaller or weak, oftentimes, what did he say? They'll try to accomplish with their titles that which they could never accomplish with their names. And what he meant by that was like they lean heavily into the idea of like, I'm the CEO, I'm the, whatever, I'm the president, I'm the this, that, and the other. And they really throw around that title, and sort of make you sort of cow and bow to like the label they hold as opposed to who they actually are. Because they don't really know who they actually are. They didn't have the opportunity to develop a sense of identity. So they rest their identity into the role they play. This also happens with parents. And so the mom who is like your entire existence is the fact that she's a mom. And, she's heavily triggered when she has an empty nest because, like, who is she without, that title of being the mom or the husband or the father or whatever? That's just a common pride-based counter-identification. They don't like, again, they get, they already have a lot of emotional charge in them, whether they know it or not. And so they don't like displays of emotions or emotionality. A common one I hear or read all the time is I catch flights, not feelings. Every time I see that is, I see it a lot on social media. Every time I see someone post that, that's an immediate trigger. Well, actually, this person catches a ton of feelings. They have a lot of feelings. And in fact, their feelings are overwhelming them. It's like the person who says, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. Well, actually, you care a lot. You care way too much, and you're flooded with how much you care. And that's why you feel the need to sort of say that and distance yourself through those types of phrases. Also, and I'm bolding these because we're going to dive into these a little bit more specifically. They're actually two subtypes. They take pride in being smarter than other people or more spiritual than other people. This is the actual holier than thou person. Any questions, comments, making sense, not making sense? Okay. All right, so there are two subtypes of this connection survival style, right? So overarching theme is this person is flooded with shock and trauma energy. They're not in their body. They are kind of unfeeling. They can come off as fatigued, flat, tired. And they have all of those symptoms we talked about previously. One specific subset of these people is called the intellectualizing subtype. These are people who retreat into their minds, and so they become very sort of like academic and thinking as a way of escaping from being physical and feeling. And so they focus on thoughts and ideas rather than feelings. They tend to isolate through intellectual pursuits. So behind a computer, or working in a lab, working in a garage, somewhere where they can be separate and alone with their thoughts. I did that a lot as a child. Like I would, other kids after middle school let out, they're on the playground or they're doing whatever, or blah, blah. I went straight to the library. I would go to the computer lab, or I'd be buried somewhere in a book. And that was just a form of isolating, of getting away from that, that larger crowd. And so that's just a tactic. this type can sometimes be judgmental or condemning of emotionality. And so that goes back to the, I catch flight, not feelings kind of, or, or that insult that people say, so is all they're in their feelings, or you in your feelings, like that kind of thing. That is sometimes a clue that like, okay, we have this subtype of the connection survival style, because it's adaptive for them to like not be in their feelings because their feelings are actually overwhelming. This, I think, from what I would say is like where the root chakra has retreated up to the third eye. So they have excess energy in the third eye, which is the intellect and the mind. And then the other subtype is a spiritualizing subtype. This is the person that didn't necessarily feel welcome into the world by people. And so they developed a stronger connection to God, to nature, and to animals. And these people often have psychic experiences and are flooded with access to like what we will say are higher realms of consciousness that less traumatized people normally wouldn't perceive. I see this a ton of the spiritual bypassers who are not grounded. Their energy is way up there, up in the heavens and the ethers and all that. And so they're very psychic. They could pick up on a lot of spiritual things, but they become flooded by it and overwhelmed by it because they're not, embodied. Just as an example, one of my teachers, she works with very high frequencies of energy, very powerful as long as she's in that environment. Oh my God, she is like, I've not seen, people as powerful as some things this woman can do. But you put her in airport, she's literally had breakdowns in an airport, like going through TSA, going through the scanner, being around that, that radiation, that electromagnetic frequency, the loud noises, the concentration of different people and all of their different energy, like it just completely flooded her and overwhelmed her. That would indicate to me that, all right, this is a subtype. She's not able to stand in her own ground and in her own body without feeling other people. That must mean her energy is like out of her rootedness and up to, that spiritual crown. Let me know if that doesn't make sense, but the overarching point is that you can sort of tell this type because they're very heavily focused on God and spirituality. They can sometimes be the holier than thou people who like condemn those who are, sinners, and these are people that like to send people to hell, and like you ain't living right in Christ and all that kind of stuff. And they can also be sensitive on the extreme end to any sort of environmental stimulation. So loud noises, pollution, and heavy EMF. If they're around like a lot of 5G towers. I know some people, for example, that like live out in the woods and all that kind of stuff just because they cannot be around 5G radiation. They cannot be around a lot of cell towers. They can't be around a lot of electronics because they literally are that sensitive to where they just pick up on that stuff and it just they can't filter it out. I think that, oh yeah. So what do we do to heal the connection survival style? Any questions before I get into this? All right, let's keep going. The overarching theme to get past this is to reestablish connection. Connection. Because the fundamental need that was not met early on in life was the need for some sense of connectedness. They have disconnected from people and their bodies. So let's start with the body. Focus on somatic. That means just the sensory feeling of being in body. I use this question, well, how are you feeling as you talk about that? You kind of have to like bring people back to their bodies when they have this style. So I've worked with someone before who's like recounting a story of something that really upset him. And he gets on and on and on. He starts talking really fast and he starts getting riled up and he starts, when I see that happening, I'm like, all right, wait, let's stop, let's breathe. What's going on in your body right now? What are you feeling? Are you clenching? Are you breathing okay? Right? How's your yeah. And a lot of times they are just not aware of that. And I'm sure we have all seen this example where somebody's telling a story about something that made them mad, or they're retelling a story about something that they found traumatic or disturbing. And then you just see them blow, it's like they're blowing up all over again. They're not noticing. They might not notice that they're yelling. They may not notice that, that they're tightening up in their muscles. They might not notice that they've stopped breathing. These types of things are what you want to bring attention back to, whether it's you or someone else. Just start being mindful of your body and get in the habit, just the practice of being mindful of your body, because these people more than others have gotten in the practice of ignoring their bodies. Yeah, catch and temper down the tendency to intellectualize or spiritualize. And so this, what's an example of this? I've had somebody, talk about a time that they experienced something that was really devastating. I think it was like a death or something, maybe not a murder, but it was something like really intense like that. And they were just talking so intellectually about it, like, oh, and this, that, and happened. And I feel like I'm, blah, blah, blah. I'm dealing with the emotional consequences of this and that. And I'm just stopping. I'm like, did you hear what you just said? Like, what you just described is actually very painful. Or just another example, someone lost a job that they had been working, with for a long time. They were proud of, and they're describing it, and like they're just sort of casually discussing it. And so I was just sort of like, okay, how do you feel about what you're describing? Because what you're actually describing is pretty painful, and that kind of thing. You don't want to do that too quickly or too soon, but it is something to just be mindful of, this tendency to like not really honor the emotional component or how something feels that happened to them. And then breathing, as I mentioned before, is something that they need to be mindful of, probably more than even others. Reconnecting to relationships. So this style has ultimately learned that people are dangerous, that relationships are, not good. And so rewiring and rehealing or healing this style really involves just reestablishing the idea that relationships are, no, they're actually a source of good. They're a source of energy. They're a source of strength and resources. Relationships are good for you rather than like being connected to people is dangerous. Like, it's just another threat. There's just somebody else that might, hurt me or cause me to lose or, or take from me, like that kind of thing. We want to just reshift how we see relationships. The way you do that is just by trying to focus on those relationships that have been positive resources. Anyone who has been through a tough time, it is very unlikely that they got through that tough time by themselves. Somebody helped you. Somebody. I don't care if it's a podcast you listen to or a preacher or a speaker you watched on TV. Somebody helped you get through what you went through. And so it's important, especially when this style goes into their sort of like reliving of the negative and reliving of what hurt. Okay, but who helped you? This style has trouble focusing on positive. They tend to harp on the negative side of things, and they do that even with people. So you got to point them back to like, well, what is the relationship that has been supportive for you? And then balance. Oh, I forgot to mention. Yeah, they also don't want relationships. So they want relationships, they want connection, but they also fear that. That's their biggest fear, but also their biggest desire. You have to live with that contrast, that competing, desire. So you often see what's called pendulation with this survival style. These are people who get close, but when they get too close, they withdraw. And so, a lot of people have certainly dated that type of person where it's like as soon as the connection and the intimacy gets close and you feel like you're closer than ever, oh, now suddenly, I leave you on red or I ghost you or I don't answer your texts, that kind of stuff. That's kind of what's going on. It's the pendulation. They have to get close and then withdraw, get closer, withdraw, get closer, withdraw. So it's like the pendulum swinging on a clock, right? Like they do what's called expansion and contraction. And you have to follow that rhythm until they get into a space where they're comfortable maintaining and sustaining connection. Because if there's too much connection, too much intimacy for too long, they're going to need to break it off and have some space before they can return to it, if that makes sense. And then, as I was saying, they're prone, just because of, it was adaptive as a survival style in the early period, they're prone to look out for the danger, look out for what could go wrong, look out for what's malfunctioning. That was just the way they survived. And now it takes extended attention and focus on like, oh, we've got to redirect you to what is working. Yes, I know you could go on and on and on about what's going wrong, about what's failing. We need to redirect your attention to, well, what is working for you right now? What did help you? What is going right? And the more you redirect their attention to those functional resources inside of them and around them, the better they will get at doing that themselves and building on those functional resources rather than feeding energy and attention into dysfunction. We want to take our energy and attention out of dysfunction and into function. Just an example of that. So when I do the rate your week on a 1 to 10 scale, right? If somebody says like, oh, my week was a 3, or my week was a 5 or a 6, it wasn't good, and this happened and this went wrong, blah, blah, blah. I try to follow up with the question, well, okay, well, why wasn't it a 0? You know, what went right? What was functional? What brought you up to a 3? What brought you up to a 5? Because you didn't necessarily have to even have that, right? So something worked in your favor. Something was in your favor because you're here. And I guess that would be the take home message. If you're alive and you're functioning, that means something is working for you. Something is a positive resource that needs your acknowledgement. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. Later on, I'm not going to do it on this, but you know, later on, I think I'll make some content on this, and particularly like a meditation, specifically focused towards just reconnecting to that life force energy that can get disrupted when someone's traumatized. But we'll save that for a YouTube video or something. So thank you all. Hope